You knocked my wife to the ground, then smirked in my face? I roared, and all of Riverdale froze. The smug enforcers in light suits still looked cocky, until I dropped their leader with 3 moves and hissed coldly, "You just messed with a retired SEAL." In that moment, fear vanished. Only truth remained. Justice will always side with the one who dares to protect their family. What state are you in? If this happened right outside your door, would you stand by or stand up? The day we moved into the house in Riverdale, the sun was high over the tree-lined street, casting light on the red-tiled roof and the obsessively trimmed lawn. I still remember the faint scent of fresh paint from the white picket fence, mixed with the hum of a lawnmower next door. Neighbors passed by, some nodding, some offering stiff smiles, but their eyes held more scrutiny than warmth. I knew that look, the way people size you up to see if you're good enough to exist in a neighborhood stamped with the label upscale. As I dragged the last box into the garage, saw them, 3 of them, all dressed in pale suits with ties tight, as if the tie itself was the badge of power. They walked in a line, leather shoes gliding over the stone path. Their eyes didn't meet mine the way a normal person might greet a new neighbor. Instead, they scanned me from head to toe, cold and superior. It didn't feel like I was a new resident. It felt like I was a trespasser entering a domain where you needed permission just to breathe. The one in the middle stood out, a blonde woman whose hair had clearly seen too many rounds of dye, now revealing brittle strands under the sunlight. Her beige suit clung tightly to her frame, paired with a smug half-smile that screamed triumph. She stopped right in front of the porch, not bothering to look at the scattered boxes or offer a single pleasantry. Her voice rang out, sweet fake, but with thorns beneath it. "We like to keep this community tidy. Hope your family knows how to fit in." The words sounded gentle, but each syllable landed in my ears like a hammer. I heard the emphasis on "your family." It wasn't a greeting. It was a warning, a reminder that we were stepping into what they viewed as private territory. I nodded faintly, not wanting to turn our first day into an argument, but something clenched inside me. Not anxiety, but restrained anger. This woman saw us as intruders, and she wanted to make damn sure I understood the position they'd already assigned us. My wife Evelyn stood beside me, still holding the bouquet she had just picked up from the nearby grocery store. She smiled, trying to keep things pleasant. I knew she only wanted a peaceful start, fresh chapter after years of exhaustion, but I could also see how forced her smile was. The woman's eyes flicked over to Evelyn, cold, searching for flaws to pick at. In that moment, I stayed silent, letting the silence speak for itself. But inside, I etched that look of contempt deep into my memory. It wasn't the first time I'd seen that look. The difference was that, on the battlefield, came from the enemy. Here, it wore civility and spoke in the name of maintaining community standards. A man standing beside her chimed in, "We have very strict rules, and everyone is expected to follow them. Of course, if you do things right, we'll get along just fine." His voice carried a subtle threat, as if even the air I breathed needed their approval. I answered with only a faint smile. I'd heard far more dangerous voices from men ready to pull a trigger, but that made it even clearer that I couldn't underestimate this arrogance. It wasn't just a warning. It was a sign that every move we made in this neighborhood would be watched, twisted into justification for punishment. As they walked away, their confident posture and the sharp thud of their shoes echoed down the sidewalk. Evelyn turned to me and whispered, "Do you think they meant something by that?" I looked her straight in the eye and replied bluntly, "I think we just got the worst welcome possible." Evelyn bit her lip, then forced another smile. She was trying to stay optimistic, but I could tell her heart wasn't settled. I looked out across the yard and saw a few other neighbors still eyeing us from a distance, only to suddenly busy themselves watering plants when I caught their gaze. Not one of them came over to say a proper hello. In that moment, I knew the new life we had hoped would be peaceful was anything but simple. This so-called standard community was polished shell-hiding bias, arrogance, and a habit of looking down on anyone who didn't fit their mold. And I knew, sooner or later, today would only be the beginning of a much harsher series of confrontation. I stepped into the house, glancing at the bare walls and the cluttered box. Evelyn kept unpacking the smaller one, face set with determination. I said nothing more, just stood and watched. Inside me, a vow tightened. I wouldn't let anyone from that smug HOA touch my family again, no matter what it. That morning, the sky was clear, a light breeze drifting through the trees, sunlight spilling across polished porches. Evelyn brought the watering can out to the front yard where the purple flowers she had planted when we first moved in had just begun to bloom. I was in the garage, still sorting out tools, listening to the sound of water trickling and her soft humming of a tune. It felt like a peaceful moment, a rare bit of calm after long days of moving and enduring the scrutiny of those so-called neighbors. Quiet didn't last long. From the end of the street, 3 familiar figures familiars approached. I recognized them instantly. Those enforcers in pale suits, strutting with their usual arrogance. The sound of their footsteps tapped in rhythm against the stone path, beat of an order about to be delivered. I frowned slightly, a chill running down my spine. Evelyn, focused on her watering, hadn't noticed them yet. One of the three stepped forward, his voice firm, cold, cutting through the sounds of birds and breeze. The flowers are not an approved color. You'll be fine. Evelyn looked up, eyes still bright with the joy of blooming petals. She blinked, thinking she'd misheard. "Excuse me, did you just say there's a rule about flower color?" Her voice was polite, touched with surprise and confusion. The man didn't bother to explain, only raised an eyebrow, board already in hand. Before Evelyn could say another word, the man in the beige suit suddenly stepped forward. Without warning, he shoved hard on the shoulder. Evelyn stumbled, the watering can flying from her hand, water splashing across petals and soil. Her body tipped and hit the freshly cut lawn. In that instant, felt like fire erupted in my blood. I dropped the tools and ran from the garage. I pulled Evelyn up, wrapped my arm around her protectively, and stared straight at the man who had just shoved my wife. Rage surged from my chest, boiling over in a shout. "Are you out of your mind? That's my wife." The man looked at me with dead eyes, showing no sign of remorse. Another one leaned back against the fence, laughing with disdain like he was watching a show. He smirked and said, "Rules are rules. If you can't handle it, maybe you should find a neighborhood that's a better your kind." I saw his eyes fix on mine, emphasizing the last word like a thin blade slicing skin. Your kind. Those two words were heavy, dripping with open contempt, prejudice too blatant to hide. Evelyn was still shaking, her hand gripping my arm tightly. I heard her breath quicken, saw her eyes welling with tears. A choking fury rose inside me, but with my wife standing there, I forced it down, letting only my voice rise, deep, steady, unmistakable. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life putting your hands on my family." A tense silence followed. The suited men stared at me with a mix of challenge and caution. They believed the power of the HOA would shield them from anything, even knocking a woman to the ground. But I knew better. This was just the beginning, a test to see if I would bow my head or stand my ground. Evelyn gently tugged my hand and whispered, "Don't escalate." I looked at her and saw the fear in her eye, but I also saw the trust that I wouldn't let anyone hurt her. I took a deep breath, stood tall, faced all three of them. "Today, I'll let it go because my wife needs to rest," I said, each word heavy as stone. "But remember this, every action you take has consequences, and I'm not the kind of man you want to test." I guided Evelyn back inside, leaving them standing there, thinking they'd just won a small victory. But I knew. I saw it, the flicker of doubt in their eyes when I didn't back down. They were used to neighbors who bowed their heads, who accepted, who didn't dare fight back. I was not one of them. When the door closed, Evelyn sat on the couch, her hand still trembling. I handed her a towel and wiped the dirt from her scraped elbow. She looked at me, voice catchy. "They don't see us as people, Marcus. They really believe they have the right to do this." I held her hand, eyes steady. "I know, and I'm going to show them they just woke the wrong man." Outside the window I heard their footsteps fading, their mocking laughter still echoing. But inside me, fire had already been lit, one that no sneer could put out. I'd faced enemies armed with rifles and grenades. Now I was up against one cloaked in regulations and false authority. The battlefield had changed, but my resolve hadn't. I knew, without question, that the peace we had hoped for had been stolen in a single morning, and from that moment on, I no longer saw Riverdale as a home, but as a new battleground, one I was now forced to fight in, not just to protect our roof, but to protect the woman in front of me, still trembling from the cruelty she just endured. The next morning, I stepped out the door with Evelyn, the image of her being shoved to the ground still echoing in my mind. I had hoped things might settle, at least long enough for us to catch our breath. But only a few steps onto Riverdale's path, I heard the familiar sounds of murmuring. An elderly woman walking her dog suddenly yanked the leash and veered off the path, muttering loudly enough for me to hear. "That family clearly has no respect. Move in here and disregard the rules. All they're doing is dragging down property value." I turned to look, and her eyes darted away, pretending to fuss with her little dog. I held my composure, but a few meters later, a middle-aged couple passed by, whispering just loud enough for Evelyn and me to catch. "See? Yesterday, they were yelling at the enforcer, obviously no respect for the community. People like that always bring the whole neighborhood down." Evelyn tightened her grip on my hand, her eyes heavy with sadness, saying nothing. The rumors had already been seeded, spreading like dry grass catching fire. I recognized the tact. It was classic battlefield misinformation, the kind enemies used to weaken morale before the fight even began. In Riverdale, the weapons weren't guns or grenades. They were gossip and carefully crafted lies passed from one porch to the neck. When we returned home, I paused at the gate. An older neighbor stood waiting, his eyes full of pity, quiet warning. He lowered his voice. Marcus, I've heard this isn't new here. This HOA's known for favoring the wealth, squeezing out anyone who doesn't fit, especially immigrant families. I've seen people so far they sold their homes in shame and left with their head. He sighed, as if there was more he wanted to say but couldn't. Then he walked off quickly, not daring to let anyone see him speaking to me for too long. His words chilled me. I understood now. What happened yesterday wasn't random. It was a setup, the opening move in a script they'd written long ago. A script designed to paint us as the problem, to tag us as the misfits, and push us out one subtle attack at a time. By noon, Evelyn had gone to the grocery store and returned with red eyes. I asked, and she quietly replied. The people at the counter whispered about how we lack decency, how we're not maintaining standards. One woman even pointed right at me and said not to let people like that ruin the community. Evelyn didn't cry, but I saw her hand tremble as she set the grocery bag down. I pulled her into my arms and held her. That kind of cheap accusation might be invisible to outsiders, but to my wife, it was a knife in the skin. Later that afternoon, I tried visiting someone I'd briefly met in the neighborhood, hoping for a neutral word. But as soon as I knocked, the door opened just a crack, and a voice called out from inside, "Sorry, we're busy." The door closed so fast I could still see the man's hand shaking. I understood. He didn't hate us. He was afraid. Afraid of the HOA, afraid of the pale suit, afraid his family would be marked the same way ours already had. Every path in the neighborhood seemed to tighten. The watching eyes, fake smiles vanished. I've walked through many battlefields, but I had never seen cowardice spread like a disease this fast. At night, I sat in the living room without turning on the light. Evelyn sat beside me, her head resting on my shoulder. We didn't say much, but we both knew. Peace was truly gone. In Riverdale, we weren't just up against few power-hungry individuals. We were facing an entire system that thrived on oppression and silence. I whispered softly to Evelyn. They're crafting a story to turn us into the thorn in everyone's side, but I swear I won't let them smear this family forever. Evelyn gave a small nod, and her eyes didn't just show fear anymore. They held a flicker of trust in me. I looked out the window and saw the silhouette of an HOA patrol gliding past, their stride smug. A sharp sense rose in me. They thought they'd sealed every exit, thought I'd shrink under the weight of wisp, but they didn't know that once you faced real danger, you stopped bowing to hollow suits in the dark. If you saw your wife being smeared just for not being part of their class, what would you do? Comment below. The HOA meeting took place in a small conference room in the center of the neighborhood. I walked in with Evelyn beside me, but this time she stayed in the back, leaving me to face them alone. From the moment the door slammed shut, I felt the weight in the air. The chairs were lined up in neat rows, everyone dressed in crisp, pale suit, ties knotted tight, their eyes fixed on me like I was standing trial. No one smiled, no one greeted me. Just the rustling of paper and a few dry coughs created the sense that I had walked into a courtroom, and they were both judge and jury. The HOA president, Lydia Croft, sat at the center. That blonde woman always appeared more polished than necessary, but today her smugness was even more obvious under her beige suit, high heels striking the floor with every turn she made. In front of her was a folder, as if she had prepared a long list of charges to bring against me. Lydia lifted her chin slightly, her smirk curling, then spoke without any pretense of formality. We maintain standards. Some newcomers aren't used to them, but this isn't a place for just any kind of people. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room, a few nods, few eyes darting toward me, quietly backing Lydia's word. I stood straight, drew a deep breath, and kept my tone even, but each word came out like a blade. You shoved my wife to the ground. Is that your definition of standards? The room went quiet for a beat, then erupted in mocking laughter. A large man in the front row slammed his hand on the table and bellowed, "If you can't handle the rules, find somewhere else. We don't need troublemakers." Applause and laughter followed, drowning out my word. No one caring what I said, no one bothering to hide their hostility. I looked back and saw Evelyn seated at the far end, her hand clenched on her lap, head bowed, shoulders trembling. I knew she was hearing every word, knew she felt dragged into the circus they had stayed. In that moment, I could feel every heart, each one pushing me to speaking, to tear through the polished facade they all hid behind. "You call this law?" I growled, each word echoing. What law lets men shove a woman on her own doorstep? What law lets gossip become a sentence? If this is how you define standards, then those standards are just paint covering rot. The noise rose again. Someone shouted, "Shut up!" Another scoffed, "Listen to him make excuses." But I saw it. Eyes in the back row shift, unsure, no longer so steady. Most still followed Lydia's lead, but I knew my words had struck at least a few untouched nerves. Lydia leaned forward, her voice cold and sharp. "Marcus Hale, you don't understand. This is a community worth millions of dollars. We can't allow a different kind of family to cause disruption and drag everything down. You should know your place." She paused, her eyes narrowing into two cold slits of light. "Or you can choose to leave on your own while you still have some dignity left." I laughed, a dry, cutting sound that sliced through the noise. "Dignity," I replied. "You use dignity as a cover for your cowardice. As for me, I learned on the battlefield that dignity doesn't come from stepping on others. It comes from standing up when your family is and I'm not going anywhere." A chair scraped hard against floor, then another man shouted, "Get out before it's too late." But I didn't move, not a single step back. I could feel the tension in the room tighten like a cord pulled to its breaking point, waiting for someone to snap it. Lydia's voice returned, softer this time, but laced with unmistakable threat. "You might think you're strong, Marcus. This isn't a battlefield. This is a community. And in this community, we decide who stays and who leaves." I looked her straight in the eye, unwavering. "If you call this a community, then I'm part of it. And if you want to treat it like a battlefield, then that's nothing new to me. Believe me, you don't want to take that path." Heavy, uneasy silence fell. No one laughed now. No one dared to toss out another sneer in that moment. Lydia sat up straighter, lips pressed tight, fingers tapping her folder like she needed to distract herself from her own rage. I turned and walked out, each step echoing on the hardwood floor, leaving behind a room full of frozen faces, some hateful, some unsure, some afraid. Evelyn followed, her hand slipping onto my arm, giving it a quiet squeeze. She didn't say anything, but I knew she understood. I had just laid the foundation for a much larger fight. Riverdale was no longer a place to settle. It had become a test of resolve, and I, no matter how far they tried to humiliate, would not allow my family to be trampled any further. That afternoon, when Evelyn returned from the grocery store, I knew something was wrong. Her face was pale, her steps rushed, both arms clutched tightly around the shopping bags as if she needed to shield herself. I stepped forward to take them from her. She looked up at me, eyes full of unease. That was all I needed to know. Something had happened. Once we were inside, Evelyn set the bags on the table, her hand trembling slightly. She told me that as she was leaving the store, two men in pale suits approached. They didn't say much, just leaned in and whispered, "If you keep speaking up, remember, we know every corner of this neighborhood." Their voices were calm, never raised, but each word landed with deliberate weight that made Evelyn's skin crawl. One of them even smirked, like he was savoring the fear he thought he'd planted. Hearing it, I felt the heat rise to my head. That threat wasn't aimed at me. It was aimed directly at the woman I loved. They wanted Evelyn to be rattled, silent, turned into a ghost, drifted through the streets without ever lifting her head. They didn't know Evelyn didn't break easily, but the fear in her eyes cut deeper than they'd ever understand. I didn't say much. I just took her hand, quietly promising myself that they'd crossed a line, and every word they uttered would come back to haunt. The next day, I came home after handling some paperwork and found a violation notice taped to the front door. The reasons were typed out clearly. Grass color not within regulated green range, fence height off by 2 centimeters, trash bin not placed in proper position. I read every line, and the absurdity pulled a cold smile across my face. What was this? Grass color? Fence height? Trash bin placement? These were nothing but cheap excuses stacked into a pile of fabricated fines. Bury me. I walked inside with the notice in hand. Evelyn saw it and simply shook her head. Her expression shadowed, folded the paper and slipped it into a drawer, refusing to let it take up one more second of her mind. But to me, each of those notices was a blade, and I would remember every single one, so that one day I could return them, sharp and exact. A few days later, while I was wiping down the car in the driveway, an enforcer strolled by and stopped. He wore an off-white suit, crooked tie, and a smile too smooth to be real. He gave me a once-over and said, half joking, half serious, "Whatever you did out there doesn't matter. Here, we are the law." He emphasized law like it was a weapon, eyes glinting with satisfaction as he watched me stay silent. I didn't answer. I just stared at him, my hand gripping the rag so tight my knuckles turned white. I could hear my heartbeat pounding, like the war drum from years ago, pulling me back to memories that never truly faded. The wind brushed past fence, but in my mind, I heard the roar of helicopter blades, the clash of metal, the short, sharp screams of my brothers breaching an enemy house on distant soil, the smell of smoke, blood, of life and death tangled together. I haven't forgotten those days, nor have I forgotten what it's like to stand face to face with men armed and ready to take my life. And now, in front of me, is just a guy in a suit who thinks his fabricated rules can bring me down. I took a deep breath, forcing down every surge of anger, making sure not a single word slipped out. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew this battlefield required a strike at the right moment. Evelyn stepped out and handed me a water bottle. She looked at the enforcer with a calm face, but her eyes flashed with pure contempt. The man gave a short cough and turned away, pretending nothing had happened. I stayed still, watching his figure disappear behind the row of houses. Inside me, Brutal memories stirred, flowing like hot blood through every fiber. I knew I could act now, but I also knew I had to wait, to strike when they least expected it. Not just to retaliate, but to make them pay with interest. In the days that followed, the violation notices kept. One day, it was the shadow from our tree, blocking shared light. The next day, it was my car, parked 5 centimeters out of. Evelyn got used to finding a letter in the mailbox every day, print, stamped with the HOA seal. She'd hand them to me without surprise, only with tea. Told her not to worry, that everything was under control. Outwardly, I stayed calm, but inside, I logged every petty attack like bullets being loaded into a chamber. One night, I sat alone in the dark living room, listening to the wind sweeping through the silent neighborhood. I knew they were out there, watching, waiting to see when I'd lose patience. They wanted me to explode, to strike first so they could point and condemn. But I'd learned patience on the battlefield, learned to wait for the exact second, and then act, fast and without retreat. Evelyn sat beside me, her hand resting in mine, eyes gazing out the pitch-black window. We didn't speak, but I knew she understood. This wasn't about violation notices anymore, or idle threats. This was war, and I was the kind of man trained for it. I closed my eyes, letting old memories rise, not to drown in them, but to remind myself who I am. I was Marcus Hale, Navy SEAL, a man who had walked through places where one wrong step meant death. Those men in pale suits thought they were the law, thought a few printed papers could break me, but they didn't know I was more ready than ever. And when I struck back, it wouldn't stop at tearing up a piece of paper. In the darkness of Riverdale, I clenched my fist, the bones in my hands crackling. I whispered to myself, just a little longer, then it's their turn to pay. That afternoon, the sky turned the color of lead, clouds rolling in and casting a pale, uneasy light over the entire neighborhood. I had just finished sorting the last boxes left in the garage when a loud pounding hit the front door. Not a knock, but the kind of fist thudding that came fast, heavy, and meant to provoke. Evelyn rushed out from the kitchen, face gone pale, her hands trembling. I moved to the door, not yet touching it, when a familiar voice rang out, sharp and hollow. "Open up. We need to conduct an inspection." The demand repeated itself, layered with the sound of shoes stomping on the front step. I pulled the curtain back slightly and saw not 1 or 2 enforcers like usual, but 6 of them, all in pale suits, holding files and radiating smug satisfaction. They had shown up in force, like they were preparing for an arrest. I opened the door, keeping my face calm. "What do you want?" A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped forward, his tie cinched tight like a noose. He leaned in, eyes locking onto Evelyn standing just behind me, his glare burning with open hostility. He didn't answer me. Instead, he reached out and grabbed Evelyn by the wrist, yanking her forward. She let out a sharp cry, face contorted in pain. I stepped in immediately, my voice dropping to a cold, low register. "Let go." Now I didn't shout, didn't growl, but the tone alone turned the entire porch to stone. The man didn't release her. His lip curled into a smirk. "What are you going to do? This is the HOA. You're just a worthless civilian." The moment he finished that sentence, I didn't wait. My body moved on instinct, drilled into me over years of combat. I gripped his wrist, pivoted, dropped my center of gravity, and slammed him face first onto the porch's hardwood floor. The impact rang out hard. His breath caught in his throat. I pressed a knee into his back, one arm locking both of his behind him. The rest of the enforcers stood frozen. They hadn't expected this. To them, I was just another problem resident, someone they could intimidate. I leaned in close to his ear, my voice low and deliberate. "I've taken down armed men in combat. You think I don't know how to handle someone in a suit?" His body stiffened, breath choppy. The others staggered slightly, exchanging uneasy glances, the arrogance drained from their faces replaced by fear. One of them stammered, voice shaking, You're military?" I lifted my head, eyes cutting like blades, and said flatly, "SEAL. Retired." The porch fell into total silence. Only the enforcer's heavy breathing broke it, along with the pounding of my heart. Evelyn stood behind me, eyes wide, part fear, part shock. But when her gaze met mine, I saw something flash through her. Relief. One of the others stepped forward halfway, about to speak, but when he caught my eyes, the words died in his throat. I slowly released the big man, but didn't let him rise with dignity. My hand stayed on his shoulder, forcing him to crawl, palm scraping the wood. When he finally lifted his head, the pride was gone. All that was left in his eyes was raw humiliation. I looked at all of them, my voice steady, firm. "I've stayed silent long enough, but from now on, anyone who who lays a hand on my wife, anyone who dares touch my family, will get it back tenfold. They glanced at each other, but no one stepped forward. Finally, Lydia Croft appeared from a distance, face going pale at the sight. She hurried over, trying to steady her voice. "Marcus, you're crossing a line. What do you think you're doing here? This is a community. We have rules." I stared directly into Lydia's eyes, answering word by word. "If your rules mean shoving women and threatening my family, then I swear I'll tear those rules down." My voice dropped, not a shout, but a cold declaration of war. A long silence followed. The men in pale suits backed away one by one, none of them able to hold their proud posture anymore. I knew that moment had changed everything. They had seen the real me, not someone they could humiliate with a stack of violation notices, but a man who had survived the harshest places on earth. That night, Evelyn sat beside me in the living room, quiet for a long time before whispering, "You showed them who you are, but are you sure that won't make things worse?" I held her hand, my eyes unwavering. "Maybe, but sometimes, to protect life, you have to show the enemy where the line is." And today, they met that line. Outside, Riverdale's light still glowed like any other night, but I knew the whole neighborhood was buzzing with the story of what happened that afternoon. The story of a man they once looked down on, now revealed as a former Navy SEAL. That story would spread, and with it, the balance of power in this neighborhood would never be the same. If you had been standing there watching, would you have stood with me or with them? Let me know. Rumors spread faster than any official HOA bulletin. In just one night, all of Riverdale was buzzing with the name Marcus Hale. People whispered that I wasn't just an ordinary resident, that the man they once saw as a thorn in their side had actually been a Navy SEAL, someone who had lived through and returned from the battlefield. The suspicious stares quickly turned into a mixture of curiosity, caution, quiet respect. That morning, as I walked down the street toward the parking lot, I could clearly hear the whispers behind me. The black guy was a SEAL. Didn't expect him to be Special Forces. Bet the HOA's scared now. The chatter echoed everywhere, enough for me to know that yesterday's down had already become neighborhood folklore. What surprised me most was that, for the first time since we moved here, a few neighbors had the nerve to approach me. One middle-aged man, worn out but with honest eyes, stopped at my porch. He glanced around as if afraid someone might see him, then quietly said, "We've been silent too long. They've bullied too many people. You did something none of us ever dared to do." I looked him in the eye and saw years of quiet suffering. Maybe fear had kept him, and many others, from standing up, but now it only took a single spark for people to start believing they could. Later, an older woman I often saw walking with a cane came up. She stopped, placed a hand on my gate, and softly said, "Marcus, we owe you." I was once fined for some nonsense and pushed into selling my old home, but I didn't have the strength to fight back. Now, with you here, at least we don't feel alone anymore. She gave a faint smile, then walked away. I knew that among the dozens of homes in Riverdale, not everyone stood with me, but at least the truth had made a few people speak words they'd kept buried too long. The truth that the HOA, beneath its mask of preserving standard, was really a tool for coercion, control, and humiliation, used against anyone who didn't fit the mold they deemed acceptable. But Lydia Croft wasn't someone who backed down easily. Just one day after the story had spread, she called an emergency meeting at the hall, with one clear goal: damage control. I attended, standing in the back, silent and observant. Lydia sat at the center, face carefully made up, her smile calm, her voice polished like it had been rehearsed. "Let's not allow someone with a violent past to disrupt the civility of this community," Lydia said, head held high, word crisp, her eyes darting toward. "Cannot let outside stories distort Riverdale's image. Someone may have served, may have accomplished, but that doesn't mean they belong in a place that values safety, stability, civility." Applause broke out from the front row, mostly from those loyal to Lydia. A few others joined in, but the clapping was lifeless. I noticed several faces turning to one another, eyes uncertain, not entirely convinced by her words. I stood still, without reacting. I knew Lydia was trying to turn my past into a weapon, to paint me as a violent man unworthy of this community. But what Lydia didn't know was that I didn't need to argue. I had something she couldn't twist: evidence. Since moving in, I had installed cameras all around the house, partly for security, partly out of habit after years of staying alert. That system had captured everything: Evelyn being shoved, the man in the beige suit manhandling her, me stepping between them and shouting back against their arrogance. It was all stored on a hard drive, every frame clear, every detail undeniable. That night I sat in my office, playing the footage on the big screen. Each time I saw Evelyn stumble to the ground, my chest tightened, but with it came a focused rage. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was about truth, and that truth needed to be seen. I didn't need rumors, didn't need cheering crowds. I needed only one thing, for everyone to see, with their own eyes, the true face of the HOA. Evelyn stepped in, placing her hand gently on my shoulder. "What are you going to do with it?" I turned to face her, eyes firm. "I'm going to release it, at the right time, in the right place, and when I do, they'll have nowhere left to hide." Evelyn was quiet for a few seconds, then nodded soft. She understood. This fight had no way back, and she, the one who had borne their humiliation firsthand, deserved to witness the day the truth came out. I turned off the screen and looked out the window. Outside, the lights in the other homes still glowed, families going about their lives like normal. But I knew, every whisper, every glance in this neighborhood now revolved around the name Marcus Hale. Some were suspicious, some had started to believe, and others were simply afraid. But soon, none of them would need to rely on whispers anymore. Because I had the truth, and once that truth was brought into the light, Riverdale would never be the same again. I started by calling an old lawyer, someone who had worked with me on real estate paperwork after I left the service. After hearing my story, he agreed to help, not just because of our connection, but because he himself had heard plenty of complaints about overreaching HOA. We sat down and began compiling a list of residents who had been pushed to the brink by the enforcers in pale suits. It didn't take long before the first few agreed to meet. An older black man shared his story, eyes reddened. "They forced me to sell, fining me over the backyard, said I wasn't up to standard. I couldn't afford to paying, had to sell low, then rent the same place back for twice the price." His voice trembled as he signed the written statement the lawyer handed him. A young woman told us how her son was banned from the community pool for being too loud. While the blonde children of HOA members splashed freely, her son was kicked out just for laughing. He asked me why they could and he couldn't. I didn't know what to tell him. She sobbed as she spoke, like releasing a weight she'd carried in silence for years. The stories kept coming, each one a different wound. An elderly man, too ill to maintain his lawn, was pressured until he signed away his home. A Latino couple described being scrutinized for how they hung their laundry, pushed so far that they finally gave up and moved out. Every sentence, every detail revealed what the HOA had buried beneath their polished narrative of preserving community value. Meanwhile, I was preparing the footage from my home camera. I trimmed it down, leaving only what mattered. The moment Evelyn was shoved, my voice shouting to defend her, and the cold faces of the enforcers declaring, "Rules are rules." Just a few minutes of video, but enough to rip the mask off the entire system. The lawyer watched it, nodded, and said, "This is indisputable evidence. Let me handle the rest." The video went online that we didn't expect much, just wanted the wider public to see the real face of Riverdale. But the response blew past every expectation. Within hours, it racked up thousands of views. By the next morning, that number had climbed into the tens of thousands. The comment section exploded. HOA tyranny exposed, clear abuse of power. No family should go through this. The hashtags #HOA abuse and #wrong target started trending. People were sharing my story as a symbol of arrogance and injustice in homeowners associations across America. Victims from other neighborhoods began chiming in, recounting their own story, creating a wave of shared outrage and solidarity. Evelyn sat beside me as we read the comments, her eyes welling with tears. She whispered, "Maybe this time, we're not alone anymore." I took her hand, and deep down, I knew one thing for sure. The fire had been lit, and it was spreading beyond the reach of those who once believed they were the law. One morning, I was trimming a few dead flowers in the yard when Mr. Richard, the neighbor who had always stayed neutral, suddenly stopped. He was usually quiet, someone who kept his distance from any trouble, but today he stood at my gate, hat in hand, face full of hesitation. I looked up, waiting. He stared at me for a long moment before speaking in a shaky voice. "Marcus, I used to believe them. I thought the HOA truly cared about preserving the value of this neighborhood, but after everything that's happened, I see now I was wrong." That hit me harder than I expected. Richard was exactly the kind of resident Lydia Croft had always relied on, the ones who believed the sweet talk and the polished newsletters about community standards. His shift wasn't just a personal confession, it was a sign that the cloak of power around the HOA had started to tear. He glanced around, then added, this time with certainty, "I don't want to live in a place where women get shoved in their own front yard. I've stayed silent too long." I saw Evelyn standing behind the window, listening to every word. She smiled faintly, eyes glistening. We didn't need Richard to do anything grand. Just his honesty, spoken out loud, was enough to punch through the wall of silence the HOA had built. I gripped his hand firmly and said quietly, "You did the right thing, and I believe others will follow." The video kept spreading beyond Riverdale. Local newspapers began reaching out, and a few reporters called, asking for interviews. I'd never liked being in the spotlight, but this time I knew the truth had to go further. I agreed to let a crew come to our home, to see the footage for themselves, to hear the first-hand stories from Evelyn and other residents who had endured the HOA's. That day, a news van parked at the gate, its antennas stretching high, and the reporters and camera crews stepped out, gear in hand. They didn't need flashy edit, just the raw footage and a few plain-spoken voices carried all the weight. Evelyn told her story with a calm, clear tone. When she reached the part about being shoved, her hands gripped each other tightly. I stood behind her, a silent but steady wall. The story aired that same evening, and with it, the spotlight widened. It wasn't just online comments anymore. Now came the calls from across the country. Some were from victims of other HOA sharing similar stories. Others came from veterans leaving messages like, "You did what many of us hoped someone would. Don't stop." The once quiet neighborhood was now buzzing in a way Lydia never anticipated. The press gathered at the gate, asking questions to anyone passing by. Some residents lowered their heads and kept walking. Others finally spoke about what they'd been through. Even those who had once supported the HOA now wavered, because no community standard could ever justify the image of a woman being shoved to the ground. I remember vividly the moment a reporter confronted Lydia in the middle of the community hall courtyard. "Do you believe allowing HOA enforcers to use force against residents is a valid way to uphold standards?" For a brief second, Lydia was speechless, then quickly snapped back, accusing them of being sensationalist media. But I saw it clearly on her face. For the first time, panic. That's when I realized something. Once the light is cast, the shadows have nowhere left to hide. For years, Lydia and the HOA had relied on one thing to enforce their grip: silence. And now, that silence was being torn apart, piece by piece. That evening, Evelyn and I sat together, watching the news stream across the screen, seeing the image of our house appear on statewide broadcast. Evelyn turned to me, her voice soft but steady. "You see, it's not just about us anymore. The whole country is watching." I nodded, fully aware that this fight had long outgrown a single neighborhood. It had become a story about abuse of power and resistance, about justice and dignity. I knew retaliation was coming. Lydia and her loyalists wouldn't sit still. But the fire had already spread, too far, too wide. No one could smother it now. And for the first time since the day I set foot in Riverdale, I didn't feel alone in this fight. The special meeting was scheduled for a Saturday night. Riverdale's community hall was packed wall to wall, every seat taken, even the aisles filled. More residents had shown up than ever before. Some came out of curiosity, some to witness the showdown the media had been covering, and others with tense faces, quietly watching to see how Lydia Croft would handle what was coming. The air was like the start of a real trial. I walked in, Evelyn beside me. In my hand was a thick folder and a laptop containing the video the entire country had been talking about. As I moved forward, I heard the whispers, felt every stare land on me, but I didn't flinch. I stepped to the podium, placed the folder on the table, took a deep breath and looked straight ahead, at Lydia sitting dead center, her beige suit still crisp, her makeup perfectly done, but her eyes no longer calm. I began, my voice clear and firm in the packed room. For 20 years, I protected this country, and now I have to protect my family from the people in pale suits sitting in this very room. Gasps and murmurs erupted across the hall. Someone began clapping, then more joined in. Scattered applause rippled through the crowd. Lydia gave a cold smirk, but her confidence had cracked. She tried to interrupt. "Marcus, you're putting on a show for cameras and reporters. We're here to talk about the future of this community, not hear you brag about your past." I didn't let her redirect anything. I opened the laptop and the screen lit up on the white wall behind her. Footage played, Evelyn being shoved, my voice shouting, the enforcer's cold word, "Rules are rules." The room went dead silent. Every sound from that video sliced through the moral facade Lydia had built over the year. When the clip ended, the hall erupted into chaos. One resident stood up, pointed directly at Lydia. "Explain this. Is this the standard you keep preaching about?" Another voice shouted, "All these years we've been silent, and now we see the truth." Arguments flared across the room. This time, silence no longer stood with Lydia. I raised my hand, signaling for quiet, then continued. "This isn't just my family's story. This is about everyone who's been forced to sell their home, whose kids were banned from playing, and who were pushed out because they didn't fit the mold the HOA preferred. It's all in this file. Every testimony, every piece of evidence. I push the folder toward the board, read it, and ask yourselves how much buried all these years. The room erupted in loud applause. I scanned the faces, those once hesitant now standing firm, even the neutral ones nodding in agreement. In their eyes, truth was no longer up for debate. No amount of polished language twist what they had just seen and heard. Lydia sat frozen, struggling to maintain her smile as her hands clenched tightly together. She opened her mouth, but any defense she tried to offer was drowned out by residents shouting for answers. I looked at her and said nothing more, because now I didn't need to prove anything. The truth had already unmasked for me. The applause inside the hall thundered, not a scattering, but a full eruption. People stood, shouted support, the sound swelling into a wave that seemed to shake walls. I stood there, scanning each, seeing in their eyes the relief, the anger finally released after years of being silent. Many residents who had once quiet were now shouting my name as if their silence had finally found a voice. In the crowd, I spotted a few enforcers shrinking toward the back. Their once stoic faces had turned pale, their eyes darting, unable to meet the cameras or the dozens of stares now fixed on them. Some tried to shield their face, others pretended to check phones, but none could escape the fact that their masks had been ripped off. An older resident stood, hand trembling in the air, his voice shaky but clear. For years, we've endured this. Today, I'm done staying silent. I stand with Marcus Hale and his family. The room exploded again. Applause and chants overwhelmed every word Lydia Croft tried to speak. She rose to her face flushed red, lips moving but forming nothing coherent. Every attempt she made was buried beneath the crowd's roar. Evelyn sat in the back row, eyes shimmering, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, and when she met my gaze, she gave a subtle nod, as if to say that every wound, every humiliation she had endured had been answered in this one moment. I smiled back at her, a rare smile after so many days on edge. Another group of residents stepped forward together, carrying the written statements I had paired with the lawyer. They placed them firmly on the table in front of the board. One of them spoke loud and clear. "We no longer trust this HOA. These are records of unjust penalties, forced sales, and we want change." The atmosphere in the hall had shifted. This was no longer a meeting. It had become an uprising powered by voices and truth. The ones who once ruled by intimidation were now cornered, stripped of protection. Lydia's justifications were drowned out by chants. Resign. Justice for the resident. End the abuse. I stood in place, needing to say nothing more. I knew I had nothing left to prove. Every piece of evidence, every voice had spoken for me. This was no longer just my fight. It had become the fight of an entire community. As my eyes swept across the room, I saw the clear divide. On one side were the residents, united, furious, filled with hope. On the other hand, Lydia and her enforcers, shrinking, speechless, no longer smug, no longer in control. They weren't the ones in charge anymore. They were the ones being held to the light. I stepped forward one more time, my voice dropping lower, slow, firm. This is the moment we decide who truly owns this place. I've lived long enough to know that silence only feeds evil. But when one person stands up, a second follows, then a third. Today, I'm no longer standing alone. Applause broke out again, strong, decisive. I knew this was the turning point, the moment no one in that room could look away from the truth anymore. If you were a resident sitting in that room that day, whose side would you be on? Lydia Croft screamed herself hoarse, both hands slamming down on the wooden table at the center of the hall. "Don't believe him. This is nothing but fabrication. A staged performance meant to smear my reputation and that of this entire board." Her face flushed crimson, lipstick smeared, beads of sweat trailing down her. Around her, the residents erupted. No one was silent anymore. Many shouted for an explanation, and others chanted demands for her resignation. I stood firm, refusing to answer her rage with words. Instead of arguing, I calmly opened my briefcase, pulled out a folder, and dropped it hard onto the table. The sound echoed, silencing the entire room. I slid the folder toward Lydia, my voice resolute. "While you drone on about standard, these documents prove you used the HOA to seize property and profit from families forced to leave. They lost their home, and you turned them into personal assets. That's the truth." Lydia paled, her eyes darting around, searching for an exit, but the pages were already being passed hand to hand throughout the hall. A resident stood and read aloud. "This contract clearly states Croft Development, a real estate company registered under your name, purchased house number 14 after the HOA issued violations at half its market value." The crowd erupted again, voices thick with anger and disbelief. More evidence followed, each sheet like another nail driven into the coffin of Lydia's reputation. She trembled, trying to hold her voice steady. This wasn't my fault. This was all legal proceed. I was just following the rule. I stepped forward again, my voice low but cutting clear. "You're right. You used the rule, but you twisted them, turned them into tools for your own gain. I've seen seen enemies exploit loopholes to rob my teammates of their lives, and now I see you using the same tax to rob innocent families of their home. But the difference is, today, I'm here to stop it. The room thundered. Many shouted, demanding answers. Croft. A few enforcers tried to slip away but were blocked by the crowd. No one wanted to miss what came next. I opened my case one more time and pulled out another folder. Lydia's eyes widened with real fear. I raised it up, then placed it in front of the entire board. And this is what you didn't see coming. While you thought you controlled everything, I was working directly with the bank. I've bought out every debt the HOA holds to keep running, which means, as of this moment, you've lost control of the finances. You no longer have the right to authorize a single cent. Silence fell like a hammer across the room. All eyes turned to me. Lydia slumped back in her chair, face drained, arms limp at her side. A young resident blurted out, "He bought the HOA's debt." The entire hall exploded. Cheers, clapping like thunder. I stared directly at Lydia, my voice cold as steel. "You once thought you were the law, that you could bend anyone to your will, but now you have no authority left. It's over." Lydia tried to rise, but the crowd no longer allowed her to justify herself. Chants of "resign" echoed through the hall, merging with the pounding of fists on tables and shuffling footsteps. A few residents stepped forward, seized the chairman's chair before her and dragged it aside, a symbol that her reign come to an end. Evelyn stood from the back row, her eyes blazing. She looked at me and gave a small nod. In that moment, I knew every humiliation, every wound she had endured now had an answer. No more whispers behind our back, no more absurd citation. We had reclaimed not just our dignity, but truth and justice for the entire community. The applause surged on. Faces once bowed, now held high. Voices once silent, now united in chorus. I stood still amid the uproar, letting the sound wash away the remnants of fear. And in Lydia Croft's stunned eyes, I saw it clearly. The final blow had landed, clean and absolute, leaving no room for escape. The moment shattered the room. Applause, shouting, the scraping of chairs, all roared into a single tidal wave. I didn't move, keeping my gaze fixed on Lydia Croft, letting her feel every pair of eyes trained on her, every voice no longer rooted in fear but in fury, in liberation. Lydia trembled, her hands clutching the edge of the table for balance. Her lips moved, but no words came out. She tried to hold her back straight, to wear pride like she always had, but her body quivered with every breath. After a long, frozen moment, she stood, her eyes scanning the sea of people for an exit. No one touched her. Every stare followed, like 1,000 silent blades. At last, Lydia turned and walked away, her once confident heels now staggering beneath, each step dragging the weight of. I kept watching her, not out of triumph and without needing to say a word. I saw someone who once called herself the law quietly vacate her seat, leaving behind a void no one wished to fill with more lies. The hall erupted again with applause. Some wept, some grasped each other's hand. The residents who had once been silenced finally saw the day they stood tall. Evelyn came to me, her eyes shimmering but resolute. I wrapped my arms around her, feeling the trembling in her body melt away. Amid the chaos, one thought echoed in my chest. Justice doesn't need to be loud, only timely. Everything I had done wasn't about victory or vengeance. It was for our peace, for a community to be freed from the grip of those who had turned it into a weapon of control. Outside the hall, the sky dimmed and amber light spilled onto the brick-lined road, but the atmosphere felt unlike any other night. People once silent now spoke openly, shaking hands, trading stories. I knew the fight wasn't over. There were still matters to settle, but in that moment, one truth rang clear. Truth had won, and it had won in the simplest, most perfectly timed way. I squeezed Evelyn's hand and whispered, "We've made it through the worst." She smiled, for the first time in weeks, a smile no longer strained, and I knew from now on, those who once ruled through fear would have to live in the silence they'd forced on others for so long. After everything that unfolded in Riverdale, I often find myself wondering, how does a community built on the ideals of order and unity turn into a place that breeds oppression and division? The answer perhaps lies in the nature of unchecked power, how easily it becomes a tool feeding arrogance. The HOA here, under the banner of standard, drove countless families into corners with absurd citations and even physical shoves at their own doors. But what struck me most deep wasn't just the abuse of authority, it was the silence of the majority. That silence, more than anything else, empowered those who crowned themselves. When Lydia Croft stepped down, I didn't cheer in victory. I understood that the greatest win wasn't about toppling a person, but about helping an entire community face the truth. The evidence I presented, the video of Evelyn being assaulted, the documents proving property exploitation, was only adult. The real turning point was when the residents found the courage to stand, finally admit they had been silent for too long. That day, Riverdale Riverdale changed. Suspicious glances turned into unified chants, bowed heads into eyes that stared forward without fear. When I reflect on this journey, I don't see it as a string of personal counterattack. It's been a mission to reaffirm a principle I learned in the military. Strength isn't about a weapon or brute force. It's the ability to hold your ground when everything around you is pushing you back. I've been on battlefields where life and death were a heartbeat apart, and I know this much. If you abandon the person beside you, the whole unit collapsed. Riverdale was no different. If every family kept quiet, the HOA would continue to rule unchecked, but when one person dares to speak up, others find the courage to follow. I still remember Evelyn's eyes as we walked back home the night the town hall erupted in cheers. They were no longer weary or afraid, but the eyes of someone freed from invisible chains. She told me it was the first time since moving in that truly felt like she belonged, and I understood then that belonging doesn't come from white fences or manicured lawns. It comes from knowing you live somewhere where justice and respect still matter. Someone once asked me why I chose to reveal I was a Navy SEAL at the most tense moment. Truth is, I never wanted to lean on my past to validate myself, but when Evelyn's wrist was grabbed by another man, when fake laws were weaponized to humiliate us, I knew it was time to draw a line. I'm not proud of being a SEAL just for the title. I'm proud because it taught me discipline, resolve, and a commitment to protect. And it was those values that told me exactly what to do when my family was threatened. The most important lesson I hope anyone who hears this story takes away is this: justice doesn't always arrive on its own. It has to be defended through action. That action might be speaking out against injustice, holding on to the evidence, or confronting the fear so many choose to avoid. And most of all, that action doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to come at the right time. Like the moment I laid that file on the table at the town hall, the entire facade collapsed within seconds. No shouting, no force, just the truth delivered at exactly the right time. I also came to understand something else. Real change never comes from a lone individual. Yes, I lit the spark, but without Mr. Peterson, the once neutral neighbor who admitted he'd stayed silent too long, without the mothers and fathers who spoke about being harassed by the HOA, without the wider community sharing the video and the press shining a light on us, I wouldn't have had the strength to move anything on my own. Solidarity was the most powerful weapon we had, and it was exactly what Lydia and her allies feared the most. As Riverdale's story spread across the country, I received countless messages from families and others. They wrote about their HOAs, about unreasonable fees, petty citations that led to losing home, and the discrimination they faced. Many said the video gave them the courage to come forward, to speak their truth. That was the moment I realized this fight had grown beyond one neighborhood. It had become a symbol of standing up against unchecked power wherever it exists. For Evelyn, the lasting lesson was the value of a voice. She had once kept quiet because she felt powerless, because she believed speaking up would only make things worse. But in the end, she understood that silence is the very soil in which injustice takes root. From once hiding behind me, she now stares straight into the eyes of those who once tried to shame her, no longer afraid. To me, that is more valuable than any kind of victory. As I sit down to write this story, I don't hope to be seen as a hero. I just want to emphasize a simple truth. Anyone can be pushed down, but anyone who dares to rise can shift the entire landscape. What brought Lydia Croft down wasn't my physical strength. It was the amplified by a community's will. It's proof that no fabricated authority can ever outlast truth brought into the light. Today, Riverdale has a new board, more transparent, more attentive to its residents. I don't expect it to be perfect, but I know that from now on, decisions will have to be weighed with fairness. Every time I pass the park and hear the sound of children laugh or see neighbors greet each other without hesitation, think back to what I said in that meeting. Justice doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be timely. And I hope that anyone hearing this story will ask themselves, if I were in that situation, would I stay silent or stand up? If you've ever seen a family, a friend, or even yourself being treated unfairly, would you be willing to be the first to speak out? The answers may differ, but I believe that when we believe in the value of truth, no one can ever take that voice away from us. For me, the greatest lesson is this: never let someone else decide your worth. Never allow those draped in polished suits or hiding behind the label of law to impose fear. We deserve to live with dignity, and sometimes it only takes one person brave enough to stand up for everything to begin to change. The story of Riverdale has come to a close, but its echoes remain. It isn't just a story about an overreaching HOA, it's a story about the power of justice, community, and of family. And if there's one final message I want to leave behind, it's this: don't wait for someone else to bring justice to your doorstep. Be the one to start, because one timely act, just one, can change an entire neighborhood. It can even change a society.